This is Fountainhead Forum 19. I'm dedicating this to my oldest brother Michael, who died back on June 15th. Today would have been his 69th birthday. We're recording on December 17th. Of course, it's just past midnight for me, but Josh is 9 hours ahead in Istanbul. How are you, Josh? And this is Josh Friedman,
I'm
yes, independent journalist. How are you, Josh?
I'm doing all right, Chris. My condolences about your brother. How are you
Yeah.
doing?
Well, that's not the important thing, although it does remind me of the fact that he absolutely loved Christmas. He would put decorations up everywhere. He would have decorated every house in his neighborhood if he could have. But anyway, you've been an independent journalist for how long now?
Well, not fully independent. I've been
Okay.
working for an investigative publication in California called Calcoast News for a decade now, and I write for other publications at times and affiliations with other media as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, I've been doing this for 10 to 12 years,
And you're
something like
also
that.
very well traveled. I'm sorry I misstepped. You weren't quite independent, but you've also been very well traveled. You've been to how many different countries, probably?
It's somewhere around 60, but I haven't tallied it up recently. in,
Okay.
rec- in recent years, I've really slowed down with that. I
Yeah.
haven't been going to a whole lot of new countries in recent years, mostly old countries.
Well, one thing I want to start off with is I know you've been to Ukraine since the war started. Can you tell me about all your trips to Ukraine and what you've seen there?
I've had a lot of trips to Ukraine in the past. Since the war started, I've just been there twice. I was there once in March, early to mid March, and I just got out of Ukraine right now. I don't know when this is going to be published,
Yeah.
but so December 2022 is my second trip, and quite different, but quite eye opening in terms of both of those trips. Back in March, I was mostly in the Kiev region, and I visited Irpin back when things were really going down there, and it was quite startling what I saw at the time. That was back when the Ukrainians and Russians were battling on the outskirts of Kiev, and Irpin is one of those towns on right on the outskirts of Kiev, and I saw just all kinds of destruction and very sad scenes, dead body after one after another, and also wounded people being carried out there, and all these elderly people evacuating. Very startling scenes. Um, but the war was in a much different phase back then. But nonetheless, I just a couple of days ago saw some quite startling stuff as well, particularly in the south. Although I did travel this time, I traveled a bit more around the country, spent time in 5 different cities over the span of 2 weeks. Just now, I spent a fair amount of time in Odessa, and then also in the south, I was in Mykolaiv and Kherson, which has been quite notable lately. And I was in Kiev and Chernihiv up in the north. And this time, the war's in a phase where Russia's really heavily targeting Ukrainian infrastructure. So I could feel that, see that. It's something you see and feel all around you, with all of the blackouts in some places. There's very frequently the electricity is off. In some places the water goes off a lot. In the case of Kherson, which had just recently been liberated, for many people they had no electricity and water for several weeks now. In fact, one home that I visited in Kherson, a woman there told me that she hasn't had electricity or water for 3 weeks straight, and her parents in another home haven't had it for more than a month straight. In Odessa, after uh, multiple airstrikes, I saw and experienced some pretty intense blackouts. So the dynamics were a lot different this time around. Ukrainians on the battlefield are having much more success, or much clearer successes, but the civilians are feeling the war in different ways, and it's uh, it's very evident what the civilians are going through in Ukraine. It's not just in a couple small pockets, as I was. No, it wasn't just some small pockets, but it's just different circumstances now versus back in March.
Certainly. So, it's December now. So, what's the weather like right now? Is it getting pretty cold there, or
Oh, it's cold.
what's
It's
it snowing?
it's been cold. It's been snowy for a while. I think
Yeah.
might have been around mid-November when it started snowing. Started snowing sometime
Okay.
in November, and when I was there, basically all around the country, snowing on and off. At times it would warm up and it'd be raining, but very wet conditions. For the most part, cold conditions, quite a bit of snow. In some places, the ground is pretty covered in snow. In other places, like in the south, in Odessa, for instance, that you're not going to see a whole bunch of snow on the ground. It tends to melt, but still, it was snowing at times while I was in Odessa, and
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of snow around the country. Pretty cold conditions.
Odessa's, almost pretty close to the border with Moldova and Romania and down in the Black Sea. Is there much action going on in Odessa, or is it mostly more around Kiev or
It's
places like that? Because Kiev is a lot
well,
more
there
up
there isn't
north.
the front. Yeah, but there's a lot of action in the southeast, and
Okay.
to some extent the south and northeast, and obviously the east and the Donbass region.
Yeah.
Kiev is pretty removed from the front now. That's a big distinction between when I was there last, because when I was there last, the Russians were basically at the city limits. My final day that I spent there back in March, it was actually the day that an American journalist was killed. Unfortunately, I wasn't there when he was killed, but I was right nearby, and unfortunately, saw his body. But at that point, the Russians were very close to actually entering Kiev proper, entering the city, as opposed to just other cities on the outskirts. But now it's much different. Now rather than having Russian troops knocking on the door of Kiev, you've got these airstrikes and these drone strikes coming in all throughout the country. Yesterday there were a whole bunch more, dozens more. Many of them are unsuccessful. Ukrainian air defense has improved a lot, but so that really impacts things in Kiev. It impacts things in Odessa. When I was in Odessa, not sure what was struck, but there there was an airstrike or drone strike that hit something, and that knocked out the power pretty much citywide for 48 hours. In some places more. Water went out for a day, and similar stuff happens in Kiev, and some similar stuff happens in a lot of places around the country. Although it seems like, based on the air defense and probably other factors, some cities might be a little more vulnerable. Maybe Odessa's one of them. Odessa's not by the front, and Odessa's not being threatened from the sea at the moment. But when a drone or a missile manages to get in and hit some critical infrastructure, then the whole city feels it, and sometimes for days at a time.
So, what are the Ukrainians do when the electricity goes out or when the water goes out? And I assume also that some cases the heat's probably going out too, right?
Yeah, if there's no electricity, then in theory there's no heating, but there are a lot of generators all around the country. People are pretty resilient there, and they're getting help from abroad in terms of generators being sent in. So generators make a big difference, but not every one, and not every business and location has a generator. So there's uh, lots and lots of it's candlelit, basically everything. And I should probably note that some of the places that do have generators, still the power will go in and out. Like you'll be sitting in a cafe or a restaurant where there's a generator. You think there's a generator working, and for 10 minutes or 1 hour it works, then it goes out, then it goes back on, and that's more noticeable in certain places where I'd say the conditions are worse. So, for instance, in Mykolaiv, the conditions are, I'd say, in between Odessa and Kherson. In Kherson, it's very critical, and in Odessa, not as such. There isn't shelling every day. People aren't walking around and shelling and risking their lives and whatnot. But obviously, the power goes out quite a bit there. And in Mykolaiv, it's a bit in between, and it seems like the power outages are more frequent. The uh, water will stop more frequently. Just driving around the city, there's a lot of destruction there. Not quite as much as in Kherson, but far more than Odessa. And driving around Odessa, for instance, you're not gonna see a bunch of destruction.
How easy was it for you to get around? Did you have cars? Were the gas stations supplied, or was public transportation still going? Or
It's going for the most part, and me personally, I was getting around this time differently. Last time, back in March, I basically had two drivers, and but I also took the train. I should note that I took the train from Western Ukraine to Kiev and back and forth. This time, I was using public transport a lot more, and I was going to different places in the country more, different regions, and public transport for the most part is working. There are some interruptions. There are some places where you're closer to the front where it's just more dangerous to go. So I don't know to what extent it's really operational there. When I was in Kherson, I did I didn't use a bus, but I did go to the bus station, and it seemed like a pretty dicey place to be. There was shelling nearby, and there were people killed when uh, that day that I was there in Kherson, and people at the bus station were basically huddled under some overhang. It was raining at the time, but it seemed like more for safety purposes than to get out of the rain. And I didn't see buses coming and going, but I believe maybe I saw some people gathered waiting to board a bus. But uh, within the city, I'm forgetting if I saw any intra-city buses going in Kherson, but there's some transport there. There's a lot of pensioners walking around on the streets, which is quite sad because it's very sad for a variety of reasons, but it's very dangerous. See pensioners huddled together on street corners waiting for food and humanitarian aid to arrive, and others just walking around the street. I saw someone bicycling in Kherson in the rain, and obviously there's shelling going on there. So there might be a bit of a lack of transport there. Maybe that's representative of areas closer to the front around the country. But for the most part in the country, the public transport is running. The trains are running. Occasionally there'll be some delay if an airstrike causes some problem. But for the most part, there is public transport nationwide.
yeah. What about their medical infrastructure? Do they have enough doctors and nurses to take care of what's going on, or
I don't
are
have as
hospitals
good.
being
I
targeted, or the hospitals staying? Are the hospitals still working? Because usually they try to reserve power for the hospitals and things like that. But
Yeah, I think for the most part the hospitals are working. In Odessa, I was told that this one region that I was staying in tends to, or maybe not a full-on region, but an area of the city or community tends to have power more so than other areas because there's a hospital there. And I might have heard that in other places as well. I did an interview with a friend of mine who's a lieutenant in the National Guard, and I think he said that for the most part, Ukraine's doing all right with medical supplies. I don't have as good of a gauge of that.
Hmm.
I wasn't visiting medical tents or hospitals, but based on what I gather, it seems like they're doing all right on that front.
How'd you get in and out of there? Did you go in through? I assume you went on the ground, maybe through Romania or through Poland, or
The first time I went through Poland, so back in March, I went through Poland. This time I went in and out through Moldova, basically going back and forth between Chisinau and Odessa.
yeah. What's the attitude like in some of the countries nearby? Are they? I mean, they're certainly flying the Ukrainian flags in Poland, and they're flying them in Georgia. How are the Romanians and the Moldovans reacting to this? Are they pretty much behind the Ukrainians as well, or?
Actually, maybe I should note the scenes on the border. So
Yeah.
last time the refugee crisis was very evident. I was crossing the Ukrainian Polish border, and there was such a huge backup at the main crossing that leads directly to Lviv that I used another one a little south of there that's up in the mountains. But even there was just huge log jams of people and cars, pedestrians and cars. It was very evident. And back then, from what little time I spent in Poland, not a lot, but what little time, it seemed like the Polish people were very supportive from the ones I talked to and from what I was hearing. And then the government messaging was everywhere. You drive back then, you drive on, maybe it's still like that. I've been back to Poland since then, but you drive on highways and there's electronic billboards or signs saying, I don't remember what it was, but like unity with Ukraine or stand with Ukraine or stuff like that. And there are Ukrainian colors displayed. It was the support in Poland was very evident, at least back then. I'm guessing it's still is similar now.
Yeah.
And in I haven't been to Romania since the war started. In Moldova, I wasn't speaking to people about it, and I just came and went very quickly. But my impression is that Moldova is very impacted. That I know earlier in the war, there are many Ukrainians who flooded into Moldova. It probably wasn't talked about as much as Ukrainians going to Poland or maybe even elsewhere in the EU, but a lot of Ukrainian refugees were living in Chisinau, and I think many still are, and many are also going back and forth. That much is very clear to me because I did go back and forth between Chisinau and Odessa, and there are lots of Ukrainians going back and forth. To some extent now, it might just be a springboard to go elsewhere, but at least between southern Ukraine, in terms of southern Ukraine, Chisinau and Moldova are a major point of connectivity. And I, from my assumptions of what I know about Moldova from the past, and having spent some time in Moldova in the past, my guess is that most people, not all, but my guess is most people, I'm not talking about Transnistria, but most people in Moldova are very supportive of Ukraine, and maybe even more so supportive. They're very concerned and staked to the outcome of a Ukrainian victory because the implications for Moldova might be bigger, more concerning than they are for Poland. And actually, it's some of the time I think the airstrikes have been knocking out power in Moldova. So the war is very real to people in Moldova.
Yeah. Uh, are these countries possibly? Are there any volunteers, maybe from Poland or Moldova, going and helping out the Ukrainians? I know there's a Georgian legion that's going to Ukraine, but
You mean fighting?
yeah, going actually to fight, or if not
Well,
fighting, maybe going to work as medics or something like that.
They're volunteers from many countries. I think the Georgian Legion is got some notoriety, and probably for
Yeah,
good reason. I mean, maybe akin to the Chechens or some Chechens on the other side. Although I know there are Chechens, I believe there are Chechens fighting on both sides. But I haven't heard about some Polish Legion or Moldovan Legion. I uh, I know of some people who volunteered. I think I know one personally, but I haven't been doing interviews with volunteers. I haven't been meeting. Well,
yeah,
maybe back in March I had come across face to face with some and didn't realize it, but I at least in terms of volunteer fighters, I haven't been speaking with many of them. One I've been speaking on and off with mostly several months ago.
yeah, yeah. So, who's mostly been left? Who's left Ukraine and who's stayed in Ukraine? Is it mostly older people who can't really move very easily, or is it children, or is it able-bodied people sticking around to fight, or what's?
Well, it's a fluid situation. Many people left. A lot of people have come back. Some people come and go. I was seeing a bit of that, where I come across people who, especially in southern Ukraine, they're coming and going, heading to other places in Europe. Like
Yeah,
they'll leave to Moldova and then right away hop on a plane and fly to Vienna or Italy or wherever, some other place in Europe. So
yeah,
there are people coming and going, but to what you're saying specifically, I really notice it with the elderly people. It's really evident. I saw it and spoke to some pensioners back in the beginning in Kiev, and back then this situation was a bit desperate. Maybe I'd
yeah.
say fairly desperate back then. I remember talking to one old lady who's walking right outside this tall apartment block that had been struck. It was very famous, maybe famous, but the photos of that apartment block had been seen a whole lot, and just poor old lady pulling one of her strollers that you see a lot of this region people use to go get groceries and whatnot. And she said, and others said that they basically have no choice, that they've got nowhere to go. And it was very evident for me a couple days ago in Kherson, but you see it all over the place, where there are these elderly people, pensioners, and
Yeah.
just physically traveling to some other city or some other country is a daunting task, let alone they're how are they going to get their life set up elsewhere? They're dependent on their pension in some of the
Yeah.
more critical areas like Kherson. They're just to survive. They're literally dependent on the humanitarian aid that's arriving, the food that's being distributed, and psychologically, it's an extremely daunting task to ask someone 7 years old, 80 years old to get up and leave a place that maybe they've been living in for decades, and to do so when maybe mentally they don't think they can handle it, physically maybe they can't handle it. So they're big barriers for a lot of elderly people who are stuck in areas closer to the fighting or more impacted.
Uh, yeah, just wondering. You mentioned Transnistria, which of course it means basically across the is it
Across the
the Dniester River. What's the deal with Transnistria exactly? Have you ever been there, or what? I mean, a lot of people probably don't even know that Transnistria exists.
I have been there. I was there one time for 5 days or so, something like that, and that was ooh 2016, I think. And back then, probably you asked 10 people, and if we're talking about Americans, maybe you ask 10 Americans and 10 don't know it exists. But I was gonna
Yeah,
say back then you asked 10 people and probably 9 don't know it exists, never heard of it. Now maybe that's not the case because it Transnistria came up a lot earlier in the war, not as much recently, but every now and then it's back in the news.
Because it's
But it
between Moldova and Ukraine, right?
well, it's a breakaway region. It's a separatist region of
Yeah.
Moldova. So there was in the early 1990s there was a war fought between Moldova and the separatists who were backed by Russia, are still backed by Russia. There's still a Russian military presence there, and there was a short war fought in the early 1990s, and it basically ended with a stalemate and ended with a frozen conflict. In that sense, kind of similar to what's happened in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, although those particularly South Ossetia, that reignited, whereas Transnistria hasn't reignited, and there's just been this de facto mini state, for lack of a better term, existing there since the early 90s. And having been there, it's a quite strange place. I never stepped foot in the Soviet Union, but among everywhere I've been, including Belarus, I'd say Transnistria is the one place where I most felt like I was in the Soviet Union, or like living or stepping foot in some reincarnation of the Soviet Union. Things are a lot different.
Yeah.
There it has a very Soviet feel, very old-fashioned feel, but then there's also just a lot of bizarre stuff where you've got this little breakaway region with its own government, its own president, parliament, its own money, its own basically everything. Although they're really dependent on Russia to exist, even as a breakaway state, because without the Russian military backing, they couldn't. But then on top of that, the prospects for people's lives in Transnistria just they aren't that high. So what tends to happen is people either get a Moldovan passport or a Russian passport, and I think in recent years getting the Moldovan passport has been more attractive because that allows you to travel in the EU. The Moldovan passport's got visa-free access, and I know people who are Transnistrian who've taken that opportunity and gone elsewhere in Europe. But it's a very interesting place, very strange place. But the proximity to Odessa and I guess elsewhere right in that region is very notable. It's right on the border with Ukraine, and Tiraspol, the capital, de facto capital of Transnistria, is very close to Odessa.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and as you pointed out, Chisinau is the capital of Moldova, and Tiraspol. So do they speak Russian there, or is that what it is? Or
yeah. So everyone there are some. Not everyone there is ethnically Russian or pure Russian, but Russian is the language in Transnistria, or Pridnestrovie as they call it in Russian, Pridnestrovie. So on the streets, everyone there speaks Russian, but I don't know what percentage of the population there also can speak Romanian or Moldovan as they may call it. But yeah, it's got a very Russian feel to it, but I'd say a more Soviet feel than Russian feel. But it's a very, with what's going on right now in Ukraine, it's a very significant location. And there earlier in the war, there had been talks and concerns about the possibility of an invasion of southern Ukraine from Transnistria, basically opening up another front there, but that hasn't happened.
Yeah. So let's get back. It's so from what it sounds like, the Ukrainians might be pushing the Russians out, or maybe the Russians are just not wanting to fight, or some say that Putin really hasn't brought all the guns out too, so that they're still fighting a limited war, but if they might escalate because they really haven't fought with everything they've got yet. What do you think? I mean, where do you see in 6 months?
I don't really buy into the whole limited war theory. Yeah. I heard a whole lot of that back in March, or just early in the war in general, and there were a lot of people asking me back then when I was in Ukraine, like, is this even a war? Because a lot of people were hearing the Russian term of special military operation, and there are some people who are skeptical of what they're seeing in the news, but it's definitely been a full-scale war. The Russians are definitely getting pushed back in many areas, if not most areas, and there's been the whole mobilization drive in Russia. So yeah, there's the possibility that there's some second invasion or second wave coming, however you may want to refer to it, and maybe the Russians are gearing up for that and training a lot of the new conscripts for that, but I don't view it as a limited war on their fronts. Like,
yeah,
they've tried all kinds of things and not had a whole lot of success on the battlefield, changed up strategies, and to little avail so far. But now on top of that, they're sending in Iranian drones and missiles and airstrikes all the time. So I wouldn't say that the Russians are just teasing an actual war, teasing full-scale war. They're it seems like they're trying what they can. Different phases, it's evident in different ways, with mobilization, with all the airstrikes, the drone strikes, and there are some talks and fears about a new offensive being launched from Belarus. And I know that frequently there are talks between high-level Russian officials and Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, but it seems like the Belarusians are not very keen on joining a new offensive or having the Belarusian military being fully integrated into the war effort. So it seems like, to me, the Russians are trying all kinds of different strategies and approaches to try to change what's happening on the battlefield. And I wouldn't say it's a limited war.
So it sounds like maybe that Lukashenko wants to support the Russians, but the Belarusians don't, and this might inspire them to overthrow them or something like that.
That might be one way to characterize it. So Lukashenko right now is basically fully dependent on the Kremlin to survive, because in the eyes of the West, he's basically lost his legitimacy from election rigging, suppression of protests, all the stuff that's gone on in Belarus years past, which has been amplified in recent years. So he used to basically play the West and the Kremlin off against each other, but he doesn't have that kind of wiggle room now. He's basically dependent on Putin, but at the same time, I guess because his population, and I haven't been there recently. I haven't spent much time. I've only been in Belarus briefly in the past, but from my gauge of the situation, is that the population there is not too keen on this war, and definitely not very keen on the the Belarusian military fully joining the war. So that probably puts serious pressure on Lukashenko, and maybe the Kremlin's approach is just to negotiate more concessions in terms of what the Russian military does within Belarus. Like back early on, a bunch of strikes were launched on northern Ukraine and I think Kiev from Belarus. So maybe there's more of that to come. There's definitely concerns in Ukraine about a new offensive or invasion, however you want to call it, being launched from Belarus, but time will tell.
Yes, but let's all remember that Lukashenko basically laughed at the coronavirus. Good for him. Anyway, uh, are there any Ukrainian are there any Ukrainian regions in your view that really would rather be a part of Russia than be a part of Ukraine, or at least where the people would rather be part of Russia than be part of Ukraine, or do they all want to?
Unfor-
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I've never been to Donbass.
Okay.
I regret not taking one or two opportunities that I had, or at least I thought I had years ago, to go there and see some of the action, because obviously there was war back then. Um, from what I've met, I don't have such a good feeling from just talking with people from Donbass, but over the years I have met some Ukrainians from Donbass, and just from my conversations with Ukrainians in general, it does seem like a significant portion of the population back then. I guess when I say back then, I mean pre 2014, would have been in favor or would have been open to joining Russia. And my guess is now that there's a very large percentage of the population that wants that, although to what extent that's really just a matter of them wanting peace and wanting an end to the war and an end to the hellish conditions that they've been living in through the past 8 years. I don't know, but I would gather that that there's significant desire among many people in Donbass, and I guess there had been among some, to join Russia. But I don't think that is. I just don't think that's the same elsewhere in the country.
Yeah.
Kherson, for instance, was not just under Russian occupation. Putin announced the annexation of 4 oblasts, 4 regions of Ukraine, and the Kherson region was one of them. And
Oh
a
yeah.
lot of people say it's truly bizarre, because within Ukraine you hear a lot that Kherson is a very Ukrainian region as opposed to Donbass. And Kherson, I haven't spent a whole lot of time there, but from what I gather, maybe more than some people, quite a few people, they prefer to speak Ukrainian, which is a little odd in that part of the country, because in the southeast, it's mostly Russian spoken. Even in Odessa, pretty much everyone speaks Russian. But in Kherson, it seems like uh, there are more people, at least for that region, who speak Ukrainian or prefer to speak Ukrainian. It seems like the sentiments there are extremely pro-Ukrainian. So, without really speculating on what Putin's motives were for selecting the territories that he did, and at this point, it's essentially meaningless, because the battlefield's deciding where, which country Kherson and other regions are going to belong to. But Kherson, I would definitely not say is a pro-Russian city or region, or people there want to join Russia. And just from all my time spent in southern and semi-eastern Ukraine over the years. I just don't see the desire in most places. Donbass, like I said, I haven't been there, and it's probably an exception, but most places in Ukraine, I didn't see the desire back then for leaving Ukraine and joining Russia, and I certainly don't now, because the sentiments and the feelings have really been hardened during the war. The Russians bombing people and cutting off their electricity and making their lives altogether very difficult does not inspire a bunch of pro-Russian sentiments. I'd say from pretty much everywhere I've been and people I speak to, that the the overall feelings are much more pro-Ukrainian now than they were before. And that's not to say before that there were a whole bunch of people or areas that wanted to join Russia.
I've there have been some reports of mass deportations from Ukraine. Is that like putting them on the trains and sending them to Siberia? Because that seems to be the technique that the Russians like to use. Have they done anything like that or not? Or do you know?
I I haven't been documenting
Yeah,
any of that, but I'm sure it's happening.
yeah,
There, there's there are numerous reports of it, and this has happened historically.
yeah.
Go one place just
It happened
slightly
with the
over,
Poles in
like
1940. In 1940, so yes.
sure. I mean, it happened with the Tatars. I was saying just going one step over from Kherson to Crimea. It's happened with the Tatars in the 1940s
Yeah.
being deported to Siberia. It's happened with countless
Oh yeah.
people.
Yeah. Is Ukraine pretty homogeneous, or are there different ethnic groups living there? I mean, it's a large country, and I mean, you talked about the Tatars and other groups. I mean, or is it pretty much all? You have some people you said who still speak Russian. I mean, is it
But yeah, in that sense,
what's
I
the
wouldn't
makeup of
describe
Ukraine?
I wouldn't describe it as homogeneous in the sense that so much of the country speaks Russian. Now, that might change in the years and decades to come. There quite possibly some of the Russian speaking areas you're going to have new generations that really frown upon the language, don't want to speak it. Maybe they don't they can't speak it so well, don't learn it so much. We'll see, time will tell, but that could very much change. But even with what's going on right now, there are a lot of cities and regions where almost all the locals are speaking to each other in Russian. And I
Yeah.
was in some of those places. So just from places that I've visited recently, still in Odessa, almost everyone's speaking Russian. This was my first time in Chernihiv. In Russian, people call it Chernigov. Still, many people refer to the city in Ukraine as Chernigov, which is uh, the Russian version of it. There in Chernihiv, most people were speaking Russian. And Mykolaiv, and again, the, a lot of people there or a lot of people in general call it Nikolaev. Nikolaev is the Russian version. Mykolaiv is the Ukrainian version. In Nikolaev, it seemed like most people were still. I'd been to Mykolaiv. Excuse me for going back and forth. I don't even know which one to settle on. But I'd been to Mykolaiv once in the past, and I was just there this week again. Most people there speak Russian. Kherson, I don't have as good of a feeling for it. Definitely everyone in Kherson knows Russian, but I'm not sure to what extent the local population or what percentage of the local population prefers speaking Ukrainian. It's definitely some of them. But yeah, in many parts of Ukraine, and even still in Kiev, they're probably. I don't have such a good feeling for it, but I get the sense that in some people in Kiev and I'm sure in other parts of the country now they don't want to speak Russian. Like you talk to them in Russian, and they'll respond in Ukrainian. I get the sense of that with some people, but even still in Kiev just now, I heard lots of Russian. It was probably 50-50, and that's about what I would gauge it pre-war as well. And that's just a rough guess from what I'm hearing on the street.
Are Russian and Ukrainian pretty close, or are they?
I'm no linguist, but
Okay.
I would say yes and no. I believe that Polish is closer, probably significantly closer to Ukrainian
Oh,
than Russian, and I've heard that Czech and Slovak are closer, that Ukrainians closer to Czech and Slovak as well,
okay.
closer to them than Russian. I'm not positive of that, but there's a lot of crossover between Ukrainian and other Slavic languages. In fact, I I've heard South Slavic languages much more than
Yeah.
Czech and Slovak. So sometimes I hear some words in Ukrainian and they resemble Serbian, for
Okay.
instance.
But I know
So
that you.
there, I mean, there are definite similarities between Russian and Ukrainian. You could say that they're close, maybe partially mutually intelligible. I know a lot of Russians can understand
Yeah.
Ukrainian, but they're definitely distinct languages. They're not the same language, and they're probably not uh, among Slavic languages even like the closest ones to each other.
Well, of course the Ukrainians use the Cyrillic alphabet, which Poland, Czech, Slovak, Romanian do not use the Latin alphabet, which we use. Also Bulgaria and Serbia, of course, use the Cyrillic alphabet. But yeah, it's okay. That was just one thing I wanted to check. And of course,
Yeah, but we'll see
Hungarian
what
is all as a language all its own. But yes,
we'll see what happens in the coming years. With I'm not saying
yeah,
that there's some movements right now in Ukraine to get rid of Cyrillic, but a lot of a lot of countries in the broader region have done so or considered doing so. Like so,
yeah,
in 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 Serbia, you still see Cyrillic all over the place, but I think people are kind of half and half with personal use of Cyrillic and Latin letters. But then
yeah,
in neighboring countries in the Balkans, they've been moving. Not Bulgaria, in neighboring ex-Yugoslav countries, they've been moving away from Cyrillic. And in Central Asia, there's a trend to move away from Cyrillic. So
yeah,
we'll see. There's definitely a trend in the broader region, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Eurasia, if you want to refer to it as
yeah.
that, to move away from Cyrillic.
Yes. As one of my Polish friends corrected me, she doesn't. She said, "I'm not in Eastern Europe. I'm in Central Europe." But yeah, I definitely think the Cyrillic alphabet is on its way out. It's not that much different from the Latin alphabet anyway, but definitely reasons to. It just seems like they're wanting to. You don't speak
I,
Russian or Ukrainian, I don't believe. How easy or hard was it to get around there speaking English?
well, I wouldn't have managed only speaking English. I don't speak
Okay.
Russian very well. I speak broken Russian, but at a lot of points in the trip, I had to speak Russian. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten
Yeah.
around. I wouldn't have managed anything. There's a lot of things I had to do in
Yeah.
Russian.
Yeah. Is
And I mean, obviously, if I could speak Ukrainian, then I could get around everywhere
yeah.
speaking Ukrainian, and a lot of people would be very appreciative of that. I can understand some things in Ukrainian, but I don't speak Ukrainian.
What was your general impression of Ukraine before the war? How many times had you visited Ukraine before the war? And of course, how many times I know you visited Russia too, of course.
Not often. I've only been to Russia
Yeah.
once. I had planned on. I actually had a flight booked to Moscow in 2020 that got canceled because COVID stuff.
Yes.
Um, but I'd wanted to go to Russia a bunch of times. I'd tried a few times, only
Yeah.
managed once. But Ukraine, I'd been. I don't know. I'd say now including the two times during the war, I've probably been to Ukraine about 10 times,
Yeah.
maybe slightly more.
Yeah.
But there had been times in the past where I'd spend the better part of a summer in Ukraine. There had been times where I'd spend a month and a half. I think in 2019 I spent about 3 months in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I've been to Ukraine quite a few times, sometimes for a week, a month, a couple
Yeah.
months.
There's certainly been some talk that Ukraine was pretty corrupt before this invasion. Is that true, or was that what you saw? Or I mean,
Yeah,
was it?
it's
But
it's a
how good, was it to be?
it's a country that's known for corruption, but I
Yeah.
think it's a country that's also been making a lot of progress. I, Now it's probably more difficult
Yeah.
to to quantify that or qualify that. The conditions right now are
Yeah.
totally different than they were pre-war. But I think more so than anything, it's a country where people have a desire to root out corruption, to make reforms, to hold politicians accountable, and I'd say that's something that's a clear distinction between Ukraine and Russia. It's evident in how Ukrainians vote, how Ukrainians protest. There's a demand among the people to hold government accountable.
Yeah. Are the Ukrainians pretty unified, or are there some who just want to throw in the towel on this?
I'd say they're quite united.
Okay.
There may be some people who want to throw in the towel, but the sentiments are just not very evident. I talked to
Yeah.
a lot of people. I went to quite a few places on this last trip, and I was wondering the same, because who wants to live in the middle of winter with no power, with
Yeah.
sometimes with no water, no internet, at times no mobile connectivity? Who who wants to live with those conditions off and on throughout winter? So I was wondering that. I was asking people, like, what are the chances that we might see some protests or just some broader demands to bring an end to the war because of this? But for the most part, I'm not seeing those sentiments there. I'm seeing a population that isn't happy with the situation, but they're adapting to it and they're willing to put up
Yeah.
with it because they don't want to concede a bunch of territory, and
Yeah.
they see the risk of Russia over and over again
Well,
invading, trying to take over the country.
well, obviously, most of the Ukrainians weren't alive at the time, but I assume also a lot of them at least have, memories of, the Holodomor, which happened 90 years ago, right?
Well, yeah, most people there now don't have memories of it, but I,
That they had grandparents or
yeah,
great
the
grandparents who
grandparents,
saw it definitely.
they know their history, and over the
Yeah.
past century, it's hard to think of a nation that's been through more than Ukraine. When
I
you
mean, yeah,
fact
yeah,
you factor in the Holodomor, the events of World War II, all the events of Soviet times, and now,
yeah,
I mean, actually 8 plus years,
yeah.
not just this year, but obviously this year has been brutal.
What happened in World War II? Or I know, the
Well,
Germans, of course, invaded the Soviet Union and went on, and of course, a lot of that land was occupied by Germany for a while. But were there some forces that were rising up against Stalin? And
yeah, and that's become a bit of a heated topic in in current times, because in Western Ukraine there there was a movement. There were forces. There there were some people who sided with the Germans in order to resist the Soviets. Yeah, so
yeah,
there was
well,
there was some of that going on, and that's become somewhat of a controversial point in Ukraine's history. But I mean, this the country went through so much. There
yeah,
were not just Jews. There were many people killed in the Holocaust there. The country was ravaged with fighting in World War II.
yeah.
So the country went through a
Well,
lot. Well, I mean, I
well,
guess back then as
yeah.
a republic, but yeah, it went through a lot.
Well, most of the Jews who died in the Holocaust were not Germans. They were, about half of them were Polish Jews, and then they were from other countries, that the Germans had invaded. Yeah, so
Yeah, my my audience knows I'm Jewish, but
yes,
probably most
yes,
people assume
Friedman.
I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish. My heritage is from that region. They all got out before the Holocaust, but
Yeah,
I come from my family comes from Eastern Europe, northern Romania, Moldova, southern Ukraine, Russia, that area.
yes, of
And
course.
yeah, actually, for that matter, I've looked into a bit of what happened in the areas in northern Romania where my family is from during the Holocaust, and yeah, those areas got hit pretty hard, and as did pretty much every. Well,
Yeah,
things were pretty bad in Romania. Things were pretty bad in a lot of countries.
yeah. Do you have any feel for what the sentiment is in among the average Russian about this war? Are the Russians protesting? Are they not protesting, or do they all carrying
For the
their picture?
most, for the most part, they're not protesting. Protesting there is pretty dicey, but there have been some pretty eye-opening images and clips coming out. I'd say right around the mobilization, a little after the announcement of mobilization, when mobilization started, particularly in some of the ethnic regions like Dagestan. Some pretty eye-opening clips of people hitting the streets, women, mothers. But that's usually
Yeah.
those demonstrations are few and far between in Russia.
Oh,
I wish I could be there.
yeah.
I wish I, if nothing else, even if not to do reporting, I wish I could just go there and speak with friends, speak with random people, just get people's sentiments and 2 cents on the whole situation. But that's just not realistic for me at the
Yeah.
moment. So for the most part, I just have to, like, in order to gauge that, I need to process what's being reported. But I should also, I have friends, I know people in Russia. I should do a better job of actually reaching out to them
Yeah.
and hearing what they have to say. Although I think I've a sense of what my friends would have to say.
Yeah, it's probably not a good time for an American to go to Russia. I don't. I certainly wouldn't if I
No,
was American.
I do not. I
Yeah,
do not want to be the next poker chip in a hostage negotiation.
exactly. I mean, it's a. Besides, is there any other country that you mentioned Belarus at least is officially sympathetic to the Russians? Is anybody else showing some sympathy to the Russians? I mean, I know
Well,
Armenia is certainly
I
behind the Russians, but that's about it.
wait, say that again with Armenia.
Armenia. I was in Armenia in August, and there was not a single Ukrainian flag anywhere. And then I went to Georgia, and the Ukrainian flags were everywhere.
Uh, okay, yeah, I get what you're saying, but I I don't agree with the way you're characterizing it. Yeah, you go
Okay,
to Georgia and the Armenian flags are everywhere, but
the,
right
the
now,
Ukrainian flags are everywhere in Georgia. Yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the
Yeah.
Ukrainian flags are everywhere in Georgia. Not just Ukrainian flags. I haven't been there lately, but probably NATO flags, probably EU flags. It had been that way, but yeah, so of course there's very widespread support for Ukraine and Georgia. In Armenia right now, there is a lot of pent up frustration with Russia, maybe more so than ever,
Oh, really?
to the point where there have even been some demonstrations, particularly recently when there was the CSTO meeting there. There have been some demonstrations calling for Armenia to leave the CSTO,
Oh, wow.
which
The CSTO
the
is
Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's
okay.
basically
Yeah.
Russia's form of Russia's own version of NATO,
Yeah.
but it's dysfunctional, and that's entirely evident based on what's happened in Armenia in recent years. And I saw
Yes.
some of that myself back in 2020, because not only is Armenia in a security alliance, defense alliance with Russia, there are Russian troops stationed in Armenia. There's a base in Armenia, and during the war back in 2020, uh, the Second Karabakh War.
Yes.
There, like, not only were there Russian troops stationed in the country, they had forward operating bases set up very close to Azerbaijan, and I saw those with my own eyes. I drove past them, and there was an agreement between Russia and Armenia that Russia would not defend Armenians fighting in Karabakh or fighting in anywhere that is internationally recognized territory of Azerbaijan. But the agreement was such that anytime that Armenia proper came under attack, Russia would come to Armenia's defense. And the exact opposite happened. Repeatedly, there were attacks on Armenia proper, and I saw the results of some of those attacks, quite a few of those attacks. And that's actually continued this year.
Yeah.
There's been continued fighting, and there's another flare up in the conflict going on right now on the road that leads to Karabakh and the Lachen corridor. But there's been continued fighting between Azerbaijan and Armenia this year, and a lot of that has spilled over into Armenia proper. And the Russian soldiers never do anything. They never lift a finger to defend their ally, defend the place where some of these Russian soldiers are stationed. So right now there's a whole lot of pent-up frustration in Armenia with Russia.
Yeah,
I know of individual Armenians who support Ukraine, and there have been some pro-Ukraine demonstrations in Armenia. And additionally, it's not just represented with Armenians; it's evident with a whole bunch of ethnic groups, and it's very sad. You have members of individual ethnic groups fighting on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine. You've got Armenians fighting on both sides. You've got Chechens fighting on both sides, and there's probably other ethnic groups also, and that's pretty representative of the whole post-Soviet space and landscape.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Dagestan, and I don't think people realize. I mean, there are about 30 different languages spoken in the Caucasus region. I mean, it's a very, very complicated and very diverse region. And I've also heard that the Russians actually sell weapons to the Armenians and the Azerbaijan. So
they do.
They're profiteering. They're profiteering off this war. I mean, what you can't have a better scam than selling weapons to both sides. I mean, the last thing you want is peace.
Well, a lot of people make the argument that the conflict only exists because of Soviet divide and conquer planning or policy, moving different ethnic groups around within the Caucasus, drawing these strange borders and creating these autonomous, semi-autonomous areas like Karabakh. A lot of people make the argument that was divide and conquer planning to keep these different ethnic groups fighting with each other, and whether that was all by design or not, they're still fighting with one another.
Yeah, they are. Armenia is in a tough situation because they don't have good relations with the Turks. I mean, they really only can get goods through Georgia to the north or Iran to the south. They don't have border. They're landlocked. They don't border anybody else. So,
well, there is a normalization effort underway. Yeah. Well, actually, for that, I was about to say with regard to Turkey, but also with regard to Azerbaijan. Whether it proves fruitful or not, who knows? But yes, of course, Turkey fully backs Azerbaijan militarily and politically, and Turkey was absolutely instrumental in what happened in 2020 and the battlefield successes of Azerbaijan. But there has been a bit of a push for normalization between Turkey and Armenia, and to reopen that border and to have goods going back and forth and to have flights between Yerevan and Istanbul. So we'll see. A lot of that is probably dependent on Turkish domestic politics. There's a whole lot going on. It's
Do
election
you
season in Turkey, but yeah, we'll see what happens. Armenia's obviously in a very difficult position where it's surrounded by a bunch of unfriendly nations, with Iran and Russia arguably being the exceptions.
yeah.
Probably Armenia's getting more help from Iran now than Russia. You can make that argument.
Well, I actually had a driver. He took me from Yerevan to Tbilisi, so that was an easy border across it. Any chance you think the Turks might actually at least admit, yes, we did the genocide. We're sorry. I mean, not saying love or pay them reparations, but at least they could stand up and say, yes, we did this.
No, I don't. I don't think that's coming anytime soon.
And of course, I mean, obviously the people who are alive now weren't responsible, but still, it's definitely one of the more tragic events in history.
I don't think you're going to be hearing that anytime
Yeah.
soon.
Have you been around?
Not from the Turkish government. No.
Yeah. Have you been around the rest of Europe and seen what the sentiment there is? I mean, it looks like almost everybody in at least the contiguous part of Europe, the part, obviously Western Europe and Central Europe seems to be pretty much on the side of the Ukrainians. Is there anybody in that part of Europe that's not on the side of the Ukrainians?
I have not been in Western Europe recently.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would characterize it that way, because in general Ukrainians feel very betrayed by, say, Germans and French to some extent. And I know obviously there are many, many people in Western Europe, Central Europe who side with Ukraine, but I don't know how genuine all that support is. I don't know how comparable it is to, say, Moldova, Romania, Poland, Georgia, particular people, like places where this conflict is felt a whole lot more than in Western Europe. I don't know to what extent people are just going to start grumbling about energy prices soaring and about inflation and general war fatigue. So I don't know. I partly intentionally, I haven't been spending a whole lot of time in Western Europe recently, but I don't have such a good gauge of how genuine the support is for Ukraine among the general population.
So have energy prices went way up in Europe, or have you noticed, are people, worried about, being able to heat their homes or not?
Yeah, they're going up, and I know that there are some people worried. I hear from some Germans who are worried, and I read in the news about some people being worried elsewhere, but I'm not sure to what extent. And thus far, there hasn't been some major shut off of the gas.
Yeah. I know the Finns are very mobilized and they're very prepared if they do. I mean, their military model is almost like Switzerland. Is anybody else that's close to Russia have that kind of preparedness that the Finns do?
I can't really speak to the Finns' preparedness. I've never been to Finland. I know some Finnish people, but I can't really speak to that. But there are countries where people have already lived through this, countries and places. So we've already discussed some of them, like Georgia, Moldova, because of Transnistria.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not to say that the Moldovan military can put up much of a fight, but there's certain, what's going on in Kazakhstan is definitely significant. Basically, the Kazakhstan government's rhetoric is such that they're preparing for war with Russia, preparing for a Russian invasion.
There was something
So,
that
so
happened. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say that they're, at least in the post-Soviet space, there are a bunch of countries and places where maybe they don't have a military that's ready to fight like Ukraine's, but they're they've lived through this, and they wouldn't be surprised if war returns or if a new invasion occurs.
Yeah, the Russians actually sent some troops into Kazakhstan. I think what, January or February. It
Yeah,
was before
that was the
Ukraine.
shut that was the shut yeah, that was the shutdown protests going on there. But
Yeah,
in months since then, there has been a lot of heated rhetoric back and forth between Russia and Kazakhstan. And
yeah,
it's pretty evident that Kazakhstan is making a pivot away from Russia toward China and maybe to some extent Turkey. The Turkish influence is
yeah,
growing in Central Asia and the whole region. But yeah, that's a it's a bit of a dicey situation because there's a large Russian minority in Kazakhstan.
yeah. And Kazakhstan also is the largest by land area landlocked country in the world. Uh, and I also believe that their border with Russia is one of the longest borders in the world. It's a huge country. That would certainly not be something the Russians would want to get involved with, especially with Ukraine
Uh, it
war as
is
well.
it is a large country. Oh,
Yeah,
right now I think a lot of people question how could Russia open up another front anywhere where
yeah,
when they're having such difficulties in Ukraine, and because of that, I mean that sentiment might even be evident in what's going on in the Latin Corridor right now with Azerbaijanis protesting and staring down Russian troops, the Russian peacekeepers stationed there, and even mocking them. So I think there's a lot of belief around the region or regions that Russia's incapable of opening up another front. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are wary of the possibility of something like that occurring. But yes, Kazakhstan is a very large country. I've, I've been there only to Astana and Almaty. Although
yeah.
I drove from Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan to Almaty, so I guess I saw a little bit of the
Oh,
south.
really?
But yeah, it's a very large country, large, long distances
It's a lot of
between
desert, isn't it?
between cities.
Yeah.
I don't know the topography so well, but I guess in southern areas, I guess you've got desert in the southern areas.
Well, yeah.
But I I think uh, in the north there's a major Russian minority, and I'm sure that's part of the concern, or a big part of the concern. But Almaty, at least several years ago, was still a very Russian-speaking city, and maybe it is still now. And I guess from the Kremlin's perspective, like that's that's still their backyard, but it'd be hard to see Russian tanks
Yeah.
rolling that far,
But
going anywhere past northern Kazakhstan.
yeah.
But who knows?
But it only has like 20 million people. It's not very densely populated. I heard
No,
one
it's not.
source
And very spread out.
that some of those protests were actually about corona restrictions, but I could be wrong about that. So maybe I was just wishful thinking. But
I I'm not
yeah,
positive. I
yeah,
wasn't following them too closely. I probably should have been, but I wasn't.
yeah. So you're certainly very well traveled. I mean, you spent New Year's. You were in New Year's Eve in Zanzibar, and where all where what are some of your favorite places to go to?
I spent a lot of time in Zanzibar, but that's for separate matters,
Yeah,
not for news, not for geopolitics. I am actually very interested in East Africa. The majority of the time I've spent in East Africa has been in Tanzania, but as a whole, the region is very interesting to me, and that includes geopolitics because it's interesting to see what's happening with what you might call China's scramble for Africa, with
Oh, yeah.
uh, with with all the Chinese financing of infrastructure projects and whatnot in the region, and to what extent China's establishing footholds, and to what extent other countries like Turkey, for instance, are starting to establish footholds and compete with them. So East Africa actually is a very interesting region to me, but I don't I don't do a whole lot of reporting there.
Yeah.
I I love Eastern Europe, maybe because it's in my blood. I lived 4 years in Bulgaria, or at least was based there, and I love traveling around Eastern Europe. I really I really wanted to spend a whole lot more time in Russia. When I was there, I really enjoyed myself, and even
Yeah.
just for life, for hanging out, I wanted to spend a lot more time there, but that's not so feasible at the moment. But Russia, Eastern Europe, and Turkey, I spent a whole lot of time in Turkey.
Yeah.
It's all. I'd like to go back to Central Asia. I'd like to spend a lot more
Yes.
time there. So this whole part of the world, kind of centered around where I am right now in Istanbul, is to me a very very interesting part of the world. Lots of stuff going on, and it's just, I mean, on top of all the news and geopolitical events, to me, it's a fun place to be.
Yes. I
A
do.
lot
I
of
do.
lot of history too.
Yeah, I do appreciate your Turkish friend calling Turkish Airlines to help me find my lost luggage, although I don't know if that helped, but I did get it back. But is there any place that you really felt unsafe?
Um,
Either crime or war or
I don't know.
anything?
I don't know if I should get into it, but one time in southeastern Turkey, I did feel unsafe. Back
So
when,
that would have been near Iraq or near Kurdistan?
uh, well,
Southeastern Turkey, yeah. Or
here
near
I better not
Syria.
call that here I better not call that Kurdistan. But yes,
Okay.
in the in the predominantly Kurdish region, yes,
Okay, yes.
back when tensions were very high and there was a lot of fighting going on, um,
Yeah.
and there were very strict controls implemented there. That's not to say that the region as a whole is overly dangerous. It doesn't mean you can't go there and visit historical sites and other interesting things. I've, I've been back there a few
Oh, yeah.
times, but uh, five 5 years ago or so, maybe a little more. There was a time there where, for multiple reasons, I did not feel very safe. And then, yeah, I've come close to the action in Ukraine and in like right over by the Armenian Azerbaijani border. I've been close to shelling, and fighting going on there.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, when I was when I was in Irpin, I this year I was seeing a whole lot of death, and
Yeah.
on the outskirts of Kiev, right by Irpin.
Yeah. I got
But yeah, I mean, in my travels, there have been random points and random places where I might not have felt so safe, but
yeah.
more often than not, I'd say I feel pretty safe in my travels. Actually, one of the least safe places I felt is my own hometown, and just up and down the West Coast in 2020 when I
Yeah.
was covering the Black Lives Matter protests there.
Oh,
Many
yes.
occasions, on many occasions, not only did I not feel safe, but at some points I literally was not safe. I got beaten up and bloodied once by looters, and there were a lot of protesters threatening me. So
Yes.
I actually, I'd say in general, I feel safer in actual war zones than I did at some of those protests.
I can imagine that. Well, war usually has some more protocols, but protests like that, it's just a free for all. But yeah, Remember everybody, Josh goes to dangerous places, so you don't have to. Anyway, so
Well,
yeah,
Los Angeles is my hometown, and
yeah,
there were
yeah,
there were some times where I felt safer
yeah.
in war zones than I did in
Because
LA.
I know you also lost your dad recently, and he was a journalist, I guess, with the L.A. Times,
With the LA Daily News.
L.A.
Uh,
Daily News. Okay,
for
I'm sorry.
I
I didn't know there was another paper out there. So yeah,
Yeah, that's been the second paper there for years. Now it's not as well known. I guess back when he worked there decades
yeah,
ago, it had a stronger reputation. They were breaking bigger stories. He was involved in some of that. And then he went on to do freelance producing for news magazine shows like 60 Minutes, 48 Hours, a bunch of them. He produced some stories for Mike
oh,
Wallace. But yeah,
is
his name was his
is
name
that
his name was Arnold Friedman or Arnie
yeah
Friedman.
is that what inspired you to get into journalism?
Actually, no, but uh, up until this year, he played a very important role, and he was very much like a help, a role model, influential in my coverage, the reporting I do. It it actually wasn't because of him that I wanted to start in journalism, but once I once I did get started in journalism, I would always look to him for advice uh, with everything from investigations to editing to ethical issues to all kinds of stuff with my coverage. And yeah, I would always go to him for advice and for editing help, among other things. And yeah, so he had a big impact on my reporting. And actually, when I went to when I went to Ukraine this first time, it was very shortly after his death. It was about a little more than a month. He died right before a month before the war started, so it was like about a month and a half
Yeah,
after his death, and that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to go. I was still dealing with a lot of his stuff at the time, but I said to myself that I want to go there to make my father proud. That's my father would be proud to
yeah,
see me reporting there. So that was that was one of the reasons why I felt the need to go there.
yeah. So your dad was pretty
You're
much a
asking,
stationary reporter. He didn't really travel outside of L.A. While you travel a lot.
well, he outside LA, but he wasn't reporting internationally, and most of his work was in LA, and most of it was related to the crime and courts beat. And yeah, so our styles were totally different in the sense that I'm traveling all around, and I'm more interested in geopolitics, and he's more focused on crime and the justice system in the U.S. and specifically based in LA, but also he, I've done some investigative work in the past, more so in the past, particularly for Calcos News, this publication that I work for in California. But I'd say that in general, my father's work was probably more investigative than mine. He had all kinds of sources and law enforcement, and yeah, he would break some hard hitting stories at times and always be pitching stuff to Mike Wallace and to CBS and other
Yeah,
networks. Yeah, so that's a bit about my father.
yeah,
He I think he did really excellent work over decades in the industry.
yeah. Uh, are there any other journalists that you really admire right now, or any journalists who really influenced your approach?
nowadays I don't really like talking about who I admire, and um, but yeah,
Okay.
they're um, not not in terms of style and really reporting, but and not just because I work for him, but I do work for Luke Radowski. But something that I really admire is in years past how courageous he's been in going all over and tracking down and going up to some of the most powerful and influential members of society. Another person who I I also essentially work for, who you probably haven't heard of, is Karen Veely of Calcos News. She's the co-founder of Calcos News, and she, uh, even more so than my father, is just very, very investigative. And
Yeah.
most of her work is more local in California, but she's produced a bunch of hard hitting stories that have led to FBI arrests, uh, lo- local law enforcement arrests as well. People going to jail, people going to prison. Essentially, the takedown recently of a county politician and a marijuana mogul in California. And so, yeah, she and my father, probably more so than anyone, have been influential in my journalism. But on top of that, there there are a bunch of individual reporters and publications that I follow and that I appreciate. I'm very interested in some of the niche publications in this part of the world, and there are certain reporters who uh, do a lot of coverage in Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, who I'm very fond of their work. Some of them I've met, some of them I haven't, and
Yeah.
I do like keeping up with a bunch of what maybe most people in your audience would think would be random news sources, or keeping up with random reporters in this region. But among among members of the media who've been really influential for me, I'd say my father and Karen Bealey the most, and then also my relationship with Luke has been such that he's given me the opportunity to do a lot of stuff on the business side as opposed to just the reporting side of news.
Yeah. Luke definitely goes out and gets the job done. Yeah. So anyway, since you've traveled so much, what places around the world are you really optimistic about? Do you think will advance? I mean, are places that are moving forward and progressing well?
Well, it's a bit of a rough, maybe a bumpy road ahead, but I think there's going to be huge changes coming from Africa in coming decades and over the duration of this century, and that's got a lot to do with why I spend so much time in Zanzibar. I mean, why I spend so much time in Tanzania? I don't know. Zanzibar is an archipelago. It's got one main island. It's never gonna it's never gonna be some massive population center. There just isn't the room for that many people there. But just across the over on the mainland, just across from Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, that's a city that's gonna skyrocket in population. It already is, and I think Dar and several other African cities that many people around the world have never heard of are going to very quickly emerge as very, very significant cities in the global landscape for population reasons, if nothing else. But the population in Dar es Salaam, in Kinshasa, I mean, even in other, Kinshasa's not in East Africa, but even in other places in East Africa, like Nairobi, um, if you you want to consider Ethiopia, East Africa. It's more like the Horn, but Addis Ababa. But regardless, all over sub-Saharan Africa, cities are going to be growing at astronomical rates, and I think Africa is going to be much more on people's minds all around the world in the decades to come. And I think it's very interesting to see the geopolitical battles that are playing out there. But even if let's say that Turkey's not growing at some astronomical rate like a lot of these sub-Saharan African regions and cities are, there's major population growth in Turkey, and I think Turkey's becoming a very significant geopolitical player. It already is. I'm very interested in what happens here, and I just think in general there are a lot of cool things to see and do in Istanbul and all around Turkey. And I'd like I'd like to spend a lot more time in Asia than I do. I haven't spent a whole lot of time in Asia, and I've spent a fair amount of time in Latin America. Latin America definitely interests me, but I've just been more focused on Eastern Europe, Turkey, East Africa in recent years. But yeah, there are a whole bunch of regions that really interest me, that really excite me, and that I think there are going to be major things happening in the years to come.
Have anything else you want to say before we go?
Thank you for having me on. It's nice to talk about all this Ukraine stuff while it's fresh in my mind. It's
Yeah.
it's actually good that I do that, because I haven't published a whole lot of stuff so far from this recent Ukraine trip, and it's interesting to tie in a bunch of other countries in the region. My condolences about your brother. Thank you for bringing up my father. I'm just eternally grateful for everything he did for me, and I'm I'm glad that if nothing else, I can go out and do some reporting to make him proud.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, it's certainly been good having you on here too. I've been trying to get some Ukrainians and Russians on here, and I'll probably see if I can get them on here eventually. But it's I've learned you gotta take people when they're available, and you just happen. I asked you a few months ago, and you just happen to be available. I'd like to get all the good journalists on here, though. I'd like to love to have Luke on, love to have Dan Dix on, Del Bigtree, Carrie Wedler, all those people. It's been good to have you on here. So yeah, I'm definitely going to share this with other people so we can hear about what's going on with the war in Ukraine. I take care of yourself, and be safe.
All right, thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Bye bye.
All right, have a good one.